Welcome to Narrative Nights. Step into a world of mystery, intrigue, and suspense. At Narrative Nights, we bring you thrilling detective stories that will challenge your mind and keep you guessing until the very end. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop a comment and let us know which part of the globe you're watching from. We're all united by the love of a good mystery. Let the investigation begin.
The Flicker of Truth. Chapter 1. A Preview of the Past. There are few things more potent in a village like St. Mary Mead than memory. It is the currency of gossip, the foundation of feuds, and the warm blanket of communal history. It was this very notion that had so captivated Mr. Edward Stone, a mild-mannered bachelor whose passion for the past was matched only by his collection of antique maps. His latest endeavor, The Spirit of St. Mary Mead, had seized the village's imagination. For weeks, attics had been aired and dusty trunks opened as families donated their forgotten home movie reels to his project. A moving picture of our history, the vicar, Leonard Clement, had declared from the pulpit. A chance to see ourselves as we once were. Miss Jane Marple, sitting in her usual pew, had thought the idea rather charming, though she knew from long experience that looking into the past was often like disturbing the silt at the bottom of a pond. One rarely knew what might float to the surface. The first glimpse of Mr. Stone's work was to be unveiled at a small tea party in the vicarage. The drawing-room, usually a sanctuary of chintz and weak tea, buzzed with an unfamiliar energy. Mr. Stone, a man whose beige cardigan seemed a permanent extension of his personality, fussed over a clattering film projector set up on a card table. "It's a trifle noisy, I'm afraid," he announced, his face flushed with nervous excitement. "But the images are quite something." Griselda Clement, the vicar's far too vivacious wife, clapped her hands. "Oh, do get on with it, Edward. I'm dying to see if you found that film of me winning the egg and spoon race in 1938. The lights were dimmed, and after a series of clicks and whirs, a flickering rectangle of light appeared on the whitewashed wall. The room fell silent, mesmerized by the ghostly, silent images. There was a village fete from a sun-drenched summer long ago, a solemn Armistice Day procession, Colonel and Mrs. Bantry's daughter at her christening, looking remarkably cross. The films were grainy and jumpy, but they held a strange power, a window into a world both familiar and lost. After a reel of harmless nostalgia, Mr. Stone switched off the machine. "That's just a small taste, of course," he said, beaming at the applause. "The real treasure is what I am currently restoring. A box of reels from the Ashworth estate." Lord Ashworth's father was a keen amateur cinematographer. From an armchair in the corner, a voice as dry as autumn leaves spoke up. "I see no value in dredging up what is best left buried, Stone. Some memories are private." Lord Ashworth of Ashworth Hall was a man who seemed to carry the weight of his ancestry in the stoop of his shoulders. His family had owned the land around St. Mary Mead for centuries, and he regarded the village and its inhabitants with a kind of weary proprietorship. Mr. Stone gave a nervous cough. "Indeed, my lord. But this is history. I found some truly astonishing footage. A complete portrait of country life. It requires careful editing, naturally, but the past has a way of developing in the most unexpected ways. One simply has to look closely at the shadows." Miss Marple, observing from her seat by the window, saw Lord Ashworth's hand tighten on the arm of his chair. The man clearly disliked the idea of his family's private moments becoming public entertainment. One couldn't entirely blame him. "I must insist," Lord Ashworth continued, his voice low and firm, "that you allow me to view these films before you show them to the entire village." Of course," Mr. Stone replied, clearly flustered by the confrontation. "A private viewing, naturally. But I assure you, it is all perfectly innocent." Miss Marple was not so sure. Mr. Stone's excitement seemed to carry a current of anxiety beneath it. He was a moth drawn to the flame of a good story, perhaps forgetting that flames can burn. She thought of a magic lantern show from her childhood, how a simple crack in a glass slide could distort a familiar picture into something strange and frightening. As the party broke up, she watched Mr. Stone packing away his equipment, his hands trembling slightly. He was a kind man, a gentle soul. But gentle souls, she knew, were often the ones who stumbled into the deepest trouble, precisely because they never expected to find it. They walked through life looking for historical footnotes and parish records, and were always so surprised when they unearthed a tragedy instead. Walking home as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lane, Miss Marple felt a familiar sense of disquiet. It was the feeling one got before a storm, when the air grows heavy and still. Mr. Stone, in his innocent enthusiasm, was arranging the memories of St. Mary Mead into a narrative. But memories, like people, had a life of their own. They could be edited, spliced, and rearranged, but the truth, she suspected, had a way of flickering through, even if only for a second. And she wondered who in their quiet, peaceful village would be terrified of what the light might reveal. Chapter 2: The Final Cut. The village hall, a building that served variously for parish council meetings, jumble sales, and the occasional rather amateurish theatrical, had been transformed. Rows of wooden chairs faced a large white sheet stretched taut across the back of the stage, a makeshift but effective cinema screen. There was a palpable air of excitement, the kind usually reserved for the annual flower show. The entire village, it seemed, had turned out. Miss Marple found a seat near the back, affording her an excellent view of both the screen and the audience. She could see Colonel and Mrs. Bantry in the front row, Mrs. Price Ridley looking formidably critical, and even Lord Ashworth, who had evidently decided his presence was required, sitting ramrod straight and looking utterly miserable. Mr. Edward Stone, looking even more frayed than he had at the vicarage, hurried between the projector and the light switch. His assistant, Vera Scott, a quiet girl with neat brown hair and an air of intense efficiency, stood by his side, handing him film reels as if they were fragile relics. "Now, everyone," Mr. Stone began, his voice trembling slightly, "do forgive the technical limitations. This is not the Gaumont cinema. But I do hope it captures a little of our shared spirit." The lights went out and the projector whirred to life. For the next hour, the hall was held in a state of rapt nostalgia. A collective sigh went through the crowd as a flickering image of the old village green, before the war memorial was built, appeared on the screen. There were murmurs of recognition, laughter at the sight of prominent villagers as awkward children, and a poignant silence during a clip of a young soldier, now long gone, waving goodbye from the station platform. Miss Marple watched it all, but her attention was divided. She noted Mr. Stone, whose initial nervousness had eased into a glow of pride. Yet as the evening wore on, and he prepared to load the final reels, his anxiety seemed to return. She saw him wipe his brow with a handkerchief as Vera handed him a canister labeled "Country Lanes and Picnics." The reel began with charming scenes, families spread out on tartan blankets, children paddling in a stream, a courting couple strolling hand in hand down a lane dappled with sunlight. A gentle, lulling rhythm settled over the audience. And then, it happened. The image abruptly changed. The sunny lane vanished, replaced by a dark, shaky shot, clearly filmed at night from a moving vehicle. The screen was filled with the glare of headlights bouncing on a narrow, hedge-lined road. For 2, perhaps 3, jarring seconds, the camera swerved, capturing a fleeting image of another motor car, a dark, handsome vehicle with a distinctive silver mascot on the bonnet, speeding away into the blackness. As it passed, the headlights of the cameraman's car swept for a single, sickening moment over the grass verge, illuminating what looked like a heap of old clothes, or a bundle of rags, lying motionless. A confused murmur rippled through the hall. Before the image could be properly understood, there was a bright flash, a loud snapping sound, and the screen went white. The projector's whirring became frantic, then died. The lights came up, revealing a room full of bewildered faces. Mr. Stone stood by the projector, his face ashen. "Oh, my goodness," he stammered, fumbling with the machine. "The film, it appears to have snapped. Terribly sorry. Old celluloid, you see. So brittle. I'm afraid that's all for this evening." He seemed utterly mortified, wringing his hands and apologizing profusely as the audience, disappointed but sympathetic, began to shuffle out into the cool night air. "What on earth was that last bit?" Colonel Bantry grumbled to his wife as they passed Miss Marple's chair. "Looked like a bit of bad driving to me." "Most peculiar," Mrs. Bantry agreed. "Did you see, Jane?" For a moment, it looked like, but she trailed off, unable to articulate the unsettling nature of the image. Miss Marple said nothing. The image had been quick, chaotic, and yet terribly clear in its implication. She had seen a distinctive silver mascot on a car bonnet before. And she had seen the unnatural stillness of that shape on the verge. The news came, as such news always does in St. Mary Mead, on the morning breeze, carried by the milkman and solidified by a telephone call. It was Griselda Clement, her voice for once stripped of its usual cheerfulness. "Miss Marple? It's Edward Stone. He's dead." "Dead?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, but her knitting needles paused in her lap. "Yes. Vera Scott found him this morning when she went to the house. He was in his study, slumped in his armchair. Dr. Haydock has been. He said it was his heart. A sudden, fatal attack. All the stress and embarrassment from last night, he says. It was all just too much for the poor man. It was, of course, a perfectly sensible explanation. Mr. Stone had a known heart condition. He was a nervous, excitable man. The public failure of his great project was a plausible trigger for a medical catastrophe. It was all very neat, very tragic, and very straightforward. And yet, as Miss Marple replaced the receiver, she did not believe a word of it. She thought of old Mr. Harris, the farmer who had coincidentally contracted a fatal chill the very week his impatient heir came to visit. Coincidences did happen, of course. But a nervous man with a secret on film, who receives a public warning, whose film conveniently breaks at the most crucial moment, and who then dies of a sudden shock just hours later. That, Miss Marple thought grimly, was stretching the laws of coincidence to breaking point. Mr. Stone's story had not ended with a snapped film, it had been deliberately and permanently cut. Chapter 3: An Orderly Demise. The death of Mr. Edward Stone was, for a full 48 hours, the sole topic of conversation in St. Mary Mead. It was discussed over the counter at the butcher's, debated in the queue at the post office, and lamented over countless cups of tea. The consensus was uniform: a dreadful business, a terrible shame, but not, when one really thought about it, altogether surprising. "His heart, you know," said Mrs. Price Ridley, with an air of mournful authority. "He always had a delicate constitution." The excitement, the public humiliation of it all, it was bound to happen. This sensible verdict was officially endorsed by the arrival of Inspector Slack. He was a man who moved with an air of permanent impatience, as if the rustic slowness of village life was a personal affront. He was there, as he crisply informed the vicar, not to investigate a crime, but to finalize the paperwork on a tragedy. Miss Marple heard of his progress from Mrs. Bantry, who had the details from her maid, who in turn had them from the constable assisting the inspector. "They say it was all terribly peaceful, Jane," Mrs. Bantry explained, her voice hushed as they sat in Miss Marple's sunlit living room. He was in his favorite wingback chair in the study, the one by the fire. He had a glass of sherry on the little table beside him, half finished. Dr. Haydock believes he simply drifted off. One moment he was there, brooding over the evening, and the next, his heart just gave out. Miss Marple's needles clicked with a steady, unhurried rhythm. And was anything disturbed? Out of place? No, that's the thing, Mrs. Bantry said, leaning forward. Inspector Slack made a point of it. The room was immaculate. Not a cushion out of place, not a paper disturbed on his desk. The inspector said it was a textbook case. No signs of foul play whatsoever, were his exact words. He seemed rather put out to have been called from much Benham for it. Miss Marple offered her guest a Garibaldi biscuit. Men like Inspector Slack are often put out by things that do not fit into neat little boxes, she observed mildly. But later, when she was alone, her thoughts returned to that tidy room. She pictured it in her mind, the quiet study, the flickering embers in the grate, the dedicated historian taking a final, calming sip of sherry. It was a serene image. And it was entirely wrong. She had, in her long life, been present at the scene of several sudden demises, both natural and otherwise. They were never tidy affairs. A sudden, catastrophic failure of the heart was a violent, shocking event. It was a moment of agony and chaos. A man in such throes would gasp, would clutch at his chest, would knock over a table or a sherry glass in his final, desperate struggle. He would not simply place his half-finished drink down with a steady hand and then compose himself for death. The scene, as described, was not one of tragedy, but of staging. It reminded her of young Georgie Simpson, years ago, who swore he hadn't been anywhere near Mrs. Bartlett's prize-winning Victoria sponge. But his mother had found his room unnaturally tidy, with his muddy boots cleaned and put away, a thing that had never happened before in the boy's entire life. It was the tidiness, the sheer unnatural orderliness of it all, that had been his undoing. People, especially when distressed or guilty, were rarely tidy. Inspector Slack, a man who dealt in blunt facts and physical evidence, would see a neat room and conclude there was no struggle. But Miss Marple, who dealt in the far more complex matter of human nature, saw a neat room and suspected a performance. Someone had wanted the scene to look peaceful. Someone had carefully placed that glass of sherry on the table after Mr. Stone had drunk from it, ensuring the scene told a story of quiet, natural death. The official conclusion was that Mr. Stone's story had ended. The book was closed. But Miss Marple felt, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that someone had merely written a deliberately misleading final chapter. And the real ending, the true one, was yet to be discovered. Sitting in the quiet of her garden, watching a blackbird methodically pulling a worm from the soil, she knew that she must now begin her own, much quieter, investigation. Chapter 4: The Missing Reel. The funeral of Mr. Edward Stone was a somber, well-attended affair. The village turned out in its entirety to pay its last respects to the quiet, unassuming man whose sudden death had so disturbed its peace. As the vicar spoke of dust and ashes, Miss Marple let her gaze drift over the bowed heads in the ancient parish church. Lord Ashworth was there, his face a mask of stony propriety. The Bantrys looked genuinely sad. And in a pew near the front, dabbing at her eyes with a small white handkerchief, was Vera Scott, Mr. Stone's young assistant. It was in the churchyard, amidst the weathered headstones and the scent of damp earth and cut grass, that the girl approached her. "Miss Marple." Vera's voice was small and tremulous, but her eyes held a look of fierce determination that belied her timid demeanor. "Might I have a word? It's terribly important." Miss Marple gave her a kind smile. "Of course, my dear. Let us walk a little." They moved away from the dispersing crowd, their footsteps soft on the grass path that wound through the older part of the cemetery. "I know what people are saying," Vera began, her words coming in a rush. "That he had a weak heart, that the shock was too much. And Dr. Haydock and the inspector, they all agree. But they are wrong, Miss Marple." "I know they are." Miss Marple did not register surprise. She simply waited, her calm, expectant gaze inviting the girl to continue. "I told Inspector Slack," Vera said, her voice dropping. "I told him that something was missing from Mr. Stone's study. He wouldn't listen. He patted my arm and told me not to trouble my head about it." "And what was it that was missing, my dear?" Miss Marple asked gently. "A film reel," Vera said, stopping by an old, lichen-covered tombstone. "The one that broke at the screening. The one from the Country Lanes and Picnics canister." Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "You are quite certain?" "Positive," Vera insisted, twisting her handkerchief. "Mr. Stone was the most meticulous man I have ever known. His entire archive is catalogued in a ledger. Every reel has a number, a label, and a specific place on the shelf. Reel number 17 is gone. The canister is there, but it's empty. And the broken lengths of film that he scooped up from the floor that night, they're gone, too. I helped him put them in a small box on his desk, and the box has vanished." She looked at Miss Marple, her eyes pleading for belief. "Inspector Slack said it must have been thrown out by mistake during the clear-out. But nothing has been cleared out yet. He didn't believe me. He thinks because I'm a woman, I'm hysterical. The minds of men like Inspector Slack work along very straight, very unobservant lines," Miss Marple commented, her tone soothing. "They see what they expect to see. And you, my dear, have seen something that does not fit." At that moment, Lord Ashworth approached them on his way to the lich gate. He inclined his head stiffly. "Miss Marple." He barely acknowledged Vera. "A very sad business, Lord Ashworth," Miss Marple said, her voice carrying its usual gentle tone. "Mr. Stone was so dedicated to his work. A true passion for the past." A flicker of something cold and hard passed through Lord Ashworth's eyes. "His passion was an intrusion, Miss Marple. He was a fool to go digging where he wasn't wanted. Some things," he finished, his gaze sweeping over the old graves, "are better left buried." He turned and walked away, leaving a distinct chill in the air behind him. Vera shivered slightly. He never liked the project." "No," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes following Lord Ashworth's retreating figure. "He did not." But her mind was on the missing reel. Vera Scott's testimony had changed everything. It was no longer a matter of vague suspicion or an instinct that a death was too tidy. This was a concrete fact, a piece of the puzzle that had been deliberately removed. One does not steal a broken, worthless piece of film out of sentiment. One steals it because of what it shows. The convenient snapping of the film, the convenient heart attack, and now the convenient disappearance of the evidence. It was all one seamless, calculated act. The murderer hadn't just taken Mr. Stone's life, they had stolen a piece of the past. "Thank you for telling me, Vera," Miss Marple said, patting the girl's arm with a gesture far more comforting than the inspector's had likely been. "You have been a great help. A very great help indeed." As she walked home, Miss Marple understood that her task was now terribly clear. She had to discover what secret lay coiled within those few seconds of flickering, shadowy film, a secret for which a quiet, harmless man had been sent to his orderly grave. Chapter 5: Whispers of an Old Tragedy. For the rest of the day, Miss Marple's mind was a hive of activity. She knitted a full 6 inches on a soft blue cardigan for her great-nephew, her needles clicking like the gears of a complex clock, each stitch a thought falling into place. The missing reel was the key, of that she was certain. But a key is useless without the knowledge of the lock it is meant to open. The image Vera Scott had described, the dark road, the speeding car, the formless shape on the verge, played over and over in her mind's eye. It was an echo, a ghost of something she ought to remember. It felt connected to the particular stretch of road near the Ashworth estate, a place that had always held a certain gloom about it, even in bright sunshine. The following afternoon she put on her hat and coat and took the path across the fields to Gossington Hall. There were few people whose memory for the minutiae of village life could rival her own, but Dolly Bantry was certainly one of them. She found Mrs. Bantry arranging flowers in the morning room, a task she attacked with more vigor than artistry. "Jane! How lovely to see you," she cried, brandishing a pair of secateurs. "Come and sit down. This dreadful business with poor Edward Stone, it's cast such a pall over everything. To think his heart just gave out like that." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, settling into a comfortable armchair. "It has been on my mind a great deal. Particularly the events of that evening. The films he showed. Oh, yes. Such a shame it all went wrong at the end. That last bit was most peculiar. Frightfully bad filming. It's curious how things can lodge in one's memory," Miss Marple mused, looking out at the immaculate lawn. "That little glimpse of the road in the dark, it stirred something. A feeling that I'd heard of something unfortunate happening on one of our lanes, a long time ago. An accident, perhaps." Mrs. Bantry put down her secateurs, her love of a dramatic recollection overriding her floral duties. "An accident? My dear Jane, it was far more than an accident. You must be thinking of the Green boy." "Green?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Thomas Green. He was a lad from the village, worked as a farmhand up at Higgins Farm. A good, strong boy, though perhaps a little simple. It must be, 20 years ago now. At least." Mrs. Bantry sat down, her voice lowering conspiratorially. "He was cycling home late one night from a pub in the next village. He never made it. They found him the next morning on the verge of that wooded lane that skirts the Ashworth estate. The police said it was a hit and run. His bicycle was twisted into a dreadful shape, and there was some broken glass from a headlamp on the road." "How terrible," Miss Marple said softly. "I do remember now. The family moved away afterwards, did they not?" "That's right. His mother was heartbroken. And the worst part is, they never found who did it." Mrs. Bantry leaned in. "The police were very tight-lipped, but of course, there were whispers. There always are. The road was barely used at night, except as a shortcut to and from the hall. And everyone knew that old Lord Ashworth, the current one's father, drove his big Bentley like a madman, especially after he'd had a few brandies. The pieces clicked into place with an awful, silent finality. The bundle of rags on the verge was a boy's body. The speeding car with the distinctive silver mascot was a Bentley. Mr. Stone, in restoring the old home movies filmed by the late Lord Ashworth himself, had not just found footage of a country lane. He had found the only existing record of his patron's father fleeing the scene of a fatal crime. No wonder the current Lord Ashworth was so opposed to the project, Miss Marple thought to herself. He wasn't just protecting his family's privacy, he was protecting its name from a 20-year-old scandal of the worst possible kind. It was all hushed up rather quickly. Mrs. Bantry finished, picking up her flowers again. Without a witness, what could anyone do? It just became one of those sad, unsolved village tragedies. Walking home later, as the setting sun drew long, dark shadows from the trees, Miss Marple felt a profound sense of clarity. The lock, she now knew, was the death of Thomas Green. The key was the missing reel of film. And poor Mr. Stone had been silenced because he was about to unlock the past and expose a secret that someone had gone to murderous lengths to keep buried. The question that remained, however, was a chilling one. Was Lord Ashworth merely protecting his late father's reputation, or had he taken far more desperate measures? Chapter 6: A Gardener's Analogy. The following morning, Miss Marple went into her garden. The air was crisp with the first hint of autumn, but the sun was warm, and her late-blooming roses were putting on a final, defiant show of colour. Gardening, for Miss Marple, was not merely a hobby, it was a form of philosophy. One learned a great deal about life and death from a small patch of earth. She was inspecting her row of chrysanthemums, which stood tall and proud, their bronze and yellow heads nodding in the gentle breeze. They were, she thought, a picture of health. Which is why the sight of one of them, a particularly fine specimen, lying prostrate on the soil was such a shock. It had not wilted or broken. It lay there as if it had been felled, its stem severed cleanly at the base, right where it met the earth. Miss Marple knelt, her tweed skirt brushing the damp soil, and examined the casualty. The work, she knew at once, of a cutworm. A nasty little pest that did its deadly business under the cover of darkness, hiding from sight, severing a life from its roots. To the casual observer, the plant had simply collapsed. Only upon close inspection was the deliberate, fatal wound revealed. How very deceptive, Miss Marple murmured to herself, her fingers gently touching the severed stem. One moment, a perfectly healthy, living thing. And the next, gone. Not from a visible blight or a violent storm, but from a secret, hidden attack. She remained kneeling for a long moment, the fallen chrysanthemum in her hand, but her thoughts were no longer in her garden. They were in Mr. Edward Stone's perfectly tidy study. He, too, had been a picture of health, for all the talk of a weak heart. And he, too, had simply collapsed. The official verdict was that his constitution, his stem, had failed him. Dr. Haydock and Inspector Slack had seen the fallen plant and declared it a natural failure. But she, Jane Marple, was now looking for the cutworm. She rose slowly, her mind working with a crystalline clarity. The analogy held perfectly. Mr. Stone's death was not a chaotic, sudden event. It was a neat, clinical severance. The murderer had not wanted to create a scene of violence, they had wanted to create an illusion of natural demise. And how better to achieve that than with a poison? A clever, subtle poison that worked from within, mimicking the very symptoms of a heart attack, leaving its victim looking as if he had simply collapsed. The half-finished glass of sherry. The detail returned to her, no longer just a sign of a staged scene, but as the likely instrument of the crime itself. A man relaxing after a stressful evening, a familiar evening ritual. What could be a more perfect, more unsuspecting vehicle? Someone had introduced a fatal pest into that glass, a cutworm of a chemical nature. She stood for a while, looking out over the peaceful, sunlit gardens of St. Mary Mead. She saw Mrs. Price Ridley's immaculate lawn, the vicar's overgrown vegetable patch, and, in the distance, the manicured grounds of Ashworth Hall. Gardens were places of beauty and life. But they were also places where, if one knew where to look, one could find all manner of potent and deadly things. Foxgloves and nightshade, monkshood and hemlock. They grew in plain sight, their innocent flowers belying the secrets they held. The wire of the murder was now clear to her, the secret on the film reel. But the how had just come into focus with terrifying precision. It was murder by poison. Her investigation now had a new direction. She was no longer just searching for a person who feared the past. She was searching for someone with a very specific and very dangerous kind of knowledge. Someone who knew not just about old secrets, but about the secret properties of the plants that grew so innocently in a quiet English garden. Chapter 7: The Poison in the Parish. Miss Marple knew that persuading Inspector Slack of anything that contradicted his own conclusions would be an exercise in futility. He was a man who disliked being wrong and detested amateur interference. Dr. Haydock, however, was a different matter entirely. He was a man of science, and at the heart of all science lay a respect for observable fact and a healthy dose of professional curiosity. She found him at his surgery the next day, ostensibly to ask for a new prescription for her rheumatism. After the business was concluded, and Dr. Haydock was putting away his file, she paused at the door. "Doctor," she began, her tone one of mild puzzlement. "You must forgive an old woman's foolish questions, but Mr. Stone's death, it has played on my mind. From a medical standpoint, was it all quite typical?" Dr. Haydock raised an eyebrow. "Typical, Miss Marple? A coronary thrombosis is hardly unusual for a man of his age and disposition." "Oh, I know that," she said quickly. "But the scene itself. I am told it was all so very peaceful. When old Mr. Abernathy had his dreadful turn at the church fete, you remember, he knocked over the entire cake stall. It was a terrible struggle. Poor Mr. Stone, on the other hand, seems to have had the presence of mind to place his sherry glass down perfectly safely before succumbing. Does that not seem a little remarkable?" Dr. Haydock looked at her, his expression thoughtful. He had known Jane Marple for many years and had come to respect the formidable intelligence that lay behind her gentle, grandmotherly facade. "It is a trifle unusual, I grant you," he conceded slowly. "The onset can be swift. But you are right. A massive seizure of that nature is almost always accompanied by extreme pain and convulsions. The neatness of the scene is an anomaly." He fell silent for a moment, tapping his pen on his desk. "It's highly improbable, Jane. But your observations are, as ever, astute." The police returned his personal effects, including the decanter and the glass. One could always run a toxicological screen, just to be thorough. To eliminate any possibility of an alternative explanation. 2 days later, the telephone in Miss Marple's cottage rang. It was Dr. Haydock. His voice was stripped of its usual calm, professional warmth, it was tight with shock. "Jane? You were right. Heaven help us, you were right. The toxicology report?" she asked quietly. "Yes. They found it in the residue in the glass and traces in the decanter. Aconitine. A highly concentrated tincture. From the aconite plant." "Monkshood," Miss Marple said, her voice barely a whisper. "The beautiful, hooded, deep blue flowers that grew in so many of the village's herbaceous borders." "Precisely," Dr. Haydock said grimly. "It's a violent, fast-acting poison. And its symptoms are almost indistinguishable from those of a heart attack, palpitations, chest pains, paralysis, and finally, cardiac arrest. I've already spoken to Inspector Slack. He was displeased. He's on his way from Much Benham. This is a murder inquiry now." After she had hung up the telephone, Miss Marple sat for a long time in her armchair, the forgotten prescription lying on the table beside her. "So it was poison," Her gardener's analogy had led her to the truth. The neatness of the death was the neatness of a careful hand administering a fatal dose. The why was the film. The how was the monkshood in the sherry. Now, all that remained was the who. Her mind began to sift through the residents of St. Mary Mead. Lord Ashworth certainly had the motive, but did he have the means? He was a man of land and titles, not of tinctures and poisons. It seemed too subtle a method for a man of his temperament. And then another face came into her mind. The face of a quiet, reclusive woman, rarely seen in the village except on Sundays. Miss Lavinia Prendergast, the daughter of the late Dr. Prendergast. A woman who had inherited her father's sharp intellect, but had dedicated it not to medicine, but to horticulture. A woman who lived alone, surrounded by the magnificent garden her father had planted decades ago, a garden famed throughout the county for its beauty and its collection of rare, exotic, and, as Miss Marple now recalled with a sudden chill, intensely poisonous plants. Chapter 8: The Picture in Focus. The atmosphere in Miss Marple's sitting room was thick with unspoken tension. It was a room designed for comfort, chintz armchairs, the scent of lavender and beeswax, a cheerful fire in the grate, but on this grey afternoon it felt like a courtroom. Inspector Slack, looking profoundly uncomfortable, stood by the mantelpiece. Lord Ashworth sat stiffly on the edge of a sofa, his face a thundercloud. And in the chair opposite him, looking pale and bewildered, was Vera Scott. The final guest, Miss Lavinia Prendergast, sat perfectly still near the window, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. Miss Marple, pouring tea with a steady hand, began to speak. Her voice was as soft and unassuming as ever. "I asked you all to come here," she said, "because this sad business of Mr. Stone has reached its conclusion. As you now know, Inspector, he did not die of a heart attack. He was poisoned with aconite, administered in his evening glass of sherry." Inspector Slack grunted. "And we know the motive. A 20-year-old hit and run, captured on film. A secret worth killing for." His eyes flickered meaningfully towards Lord Ashworth. "Precisely," Miss Marple agreed. Mr. Stone found the evidence that the late Lord Ashworth, a notoriously fast driver, killed young Thomas Green with his Bentley and drove away. "You, Lord Ashworth," she said, turning her calm blue eyes upon him, "were furious that Mr. Stone was digging into your family's past. You had the strongest possible motive to silence him and destroy that film." Lord Ashworth shot to his feet. "This is an outrage. I will not be accused." "Please sit down, my lord," Miss Marple said, her voice never rising. "Because you see, you did not kill Mr. Stone. You have been acting like a guilty man, it is true. But you were protecting your father's reputation from scandal, not from a murder charge. You are far too direct a man for subtle poisons. Your method would have been threats and lawyers, not tinctures." She paused, letting the statement hang in the air. Inspector Slack stared, nonplussed. "But if not him," the inspector began. "We have all been looking at the wrong motor car," Miss Marple said simply. Mrs. Bantry described the car in the village's memory as the Ashworth Bentley, because that was the rumor. But the film, Vera told me, was shaky and dark. The car was identifiable not by its make, but by its distinctive silver mascot on the bonnet. And in this part of the county, 20 years ago, there was another well-known car with such a mascot. Not a Bentley, but a Rover P4. A car that belonged to a man everyone trusted implicitly. A dreadful silence fell over the room. Miss Marple turned her gaze to the woman by the window. "The car belonged to your father, Dr. Prendergast, did it not, Miss Lavinia?" Lavinia Prendergast did not move, but a muscle in her jaw tightened. "My father was a saint," she said, her voice thin and cold. "He was a brilliant doctor," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But he was also a man. A man who, on one tragic night, drove home after having too much to drink at a medical dinner. On that dark lane, he struck and killed Thomas Green. A terrible, tragic mistake. But instead of stopping, he drove on. To protect his reputation, his career, his sainted image. And you, his daughter, have spent your entire life protecting that secret." "It's a lie," Lavinia whispered. "Is it?" Miss Marple asked. "Mr. Stone must have recognized the car. He would have approached you, discreetly." "Vera," she said, turning to the girl, "did Miss Prendergast visit Mr. Stone on the day of the film screening?" Vera looked startled. "Why, yes. That afternoon. She brought him a package of her father's old medical journals for the archive. She was with him in the study for nearly half an hour." Miss Marple nodded. "Long enough to have a conversation. And long enough, while Mr. Stone was fetching a book from another room, perhaps, to add a colorless tincture from a small vial to the sherry decanter on the sideboard. A tincture prepared from the monkshood that grows in such abundance in your magnificent garden. You killed him to protect a memory. Then, during the commotion at the screening, you stole the film reel that you knew would condemn your father's name forever." Lavinia Prendergast rose slowly to her feet. The quiet, reclusive spinster was gone. In her place was a woman of formidable, chilling resolve. "He saved hundreds of lives," she said, her voice clear and hard. "He was a great man. Was his entire legacy to be destroyed by one foolish mistake? By the life of a common farmhand? I did what was necessary. Mr. Stone was a grubby little man, digging in places he did not belong. I simply tided him away." Inspector Slack, for once in his life, was speechless. He stared at the quiet, dignified woman who had just confessed to a meticulously planned murder. He moved towards her, his duty finally overcoming his astonishment. Later, after the inspector had gone, taking a silent and unresisting Miss Prendergast with him, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting finally still. Vera, her eyes wide with shock, sat opposite her. "To do such a thing for a secret 20 years old," the girl murmured. "It is a terrible thing, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, "when love and loyalty are twisted into something hard and unforgiving." Miss Prendergast spent her whole life tending to her father's memory, just as she tended to her garden. She cultivated it, protected it, and ruthlessly pruned away anything that threatened its perfection. She looked into the fire, her gaze distant. "The deadliest poisons, you see, do not always grow in the soil. Sometimes they grow in the heart."